because you could just shoot and shoot the enemy, and they'll just take a bullet to the head 2 or 3 times. They may not even flinch, and it kind of takes me out of the game. It makes it more challenging in a way that I don't think's fun or clever. I don't care that you have to shoot them a few times, but they should at least react, and they don't always in a way that I think. I just think that the first 2 games shooting was much, much better set up. And in the 4th game as well, actually. It's only this one that I have this issue with. And it really takes the fun out of most of the shootouts where, like I said before, I was a pistol assault rifle guy. In this game, I'm just straight shotgun for everybody because it's the only way to take them out.
Came over to my side. Welcome. No, I don't know why Uncharted 3 is a little bit more of a boss sponge experience, because I do, even though I played this game 4 years ago, I remember that too, because early on in like one of the first chapters, you're just like shooting guys in suits, right?
Exactly.
It's not like they have like huge ass body armor on or anything like that, which actually some of the enemies did in Uncharted 2. These games do shoot for realism in some areas, right? So like when you were shooting these guys in like tuxedos and they were like taking like 5 shots, it's kind of jarring and weird. And I just don't know what feel like maybe they had to balance the game since they added throwing the grenades back mechanic. So it's like, well, if you can do that, maybe they have to be tougher to shoot or whatever, which I think is like not true. You don't have to do that, but maybe that was part of their thinking, because it is weird. It is only Uncharted 3 where it's kind of like that.
Yeah, and my issue is if it was the first game in the series and they had that, I wouldn't like it, but it wouldn't be as jarring. It wouldn't be as big of an issue. I probably even point it out. I just think, oh, that's kind of weird, but never put a second thought to it. But at the end of the day, it's a change that, in my opinion, is for the worst. And a big part of games that I've been thinking about lately is just like you need allies that are fun to play with, you also need enemies that are fun to play against. And I don't have fun playing against the enemies in this game pretty much at all. I love, like the sequence where you're riding a horse through the desert. I think the environmental stuff's great. Once again,
I love that.
The climbing mechanics are as slick as ever. The shootout where you're in the desert, just how it does that and obscures parts of the map, so you have to be crafty and keep track by memory of where everybody is and which buildings where. I really like that.
To be honest, though, I think that's the most difficult encounter in the whole franchise, though. Like right when you're about to enter the gates of wherever you're going, it's like Lost Desert City. Me, that was the hardest freaking encounter in all the Uncharted games for me.
It's the second for me. It was tough, but it was tough in a good way. I thought it was a healthy challenge. Same with this other one we mentioned.
Well, it was definitely shaking things up, because usually you can see where you're going, and like even that is difficult in this encounter, which kind of feels like it gives the enemies the upper hand, even though that they would be dealing with it just as much as you. So yeah, it definitely gives that extra level of challenge before you go fight like your demons and shit.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. I died 4 or 5 times in that. I thought it was fair. I liked it. I loved the gimmick of it. I remember it, so that's a good sign. But the fight where you're so the map is essentially a bunch of ships floating, and then there's a larger ship, maybe 2 larger ships, and there's snipers all along larger ships. There's people on the individual boats. You can swim from boat to boat and take people out stealthily. You can go underwater and dive deep to avoid bullets. There's an RPG or 2, and it's just a ton of enemies. There's so much. There's a lot of cover, but as much cover, there's twice as many enemies. And it was fun. It was challenging. This one got to the point where it was a little too hard, where it was like, I don't know, guys. I feel like this is, padding it out a little bit, because the games typically are pretty easy. So when there's a huge difficulty spike, it does stand out, in my opinion. But those 2 for me are the hardest in the whole series, and they're both in this game.
I agree with you there. Again, not in a super negative way. I mean, it is like the 3rd game. the odds of playing the third game first are probably pretty low. Probably a weird choice. So for those of us who have played the other two, I think it's a kind of a natural progression, even if it does spike here and there.
Yeah, that's true because the second game is much harder than the first. But yeah, I mean, typically, I think in terms of gameplay, I don't have any serious issues. Like I said, there's just points where there's forced hand-to-hand combat that I think's unnecessary. The bullet sponging kind of pisses me off. But it's just a more polished version of the second. You could tell. I feel like this game was rushed. I looked a lot into the behind the scenes of these games. I feel like I read somewhere this one was rushed. A lot of people were disappointed by it. Overall, I liked it a lot. I liked it less than the first two, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of, for me personally, Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3 are pretty closely matched. I generally think that the franchise is better with each game, at least for what I look for in the Uncharted series. But I feel like Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3 both have slightly different strengths and weaknesses. And they, a strength for 2 might make up for a weakness in 3, or a strength in 3 might make up for a weakness in 2, where I both pretty much think that they're like 8.5, 9 out of 10 kind of experiences for me. And of course, there's a huge leap going into Uncharted 4 because it was a native PS4 game, not a PS3 game. I also had more time in the oven. For sure.
So yeah, for me, Uncharted 3 it's a 7.5. Which is still really fun. I really enjoyed most of it. Like I said, the shootout parts really were a damper on it for me. But other than that, I enjoyed the gameplay thoroughly.
Yeah.
I liked the game. The story was fine. Ultimately, once again, the final boss thing's another quick time event, which is just silly, but fuck it, whatever.
Yeah, while the whole city is sinking and everything.
Yeah, at least the platforming bits when the city's sinking is really exciting. It's pretty easy for what you'd expect, but that's fine. I don't need to die 100 times to have fun.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same page. As long as it gets my blood pumping, I don't have to die. Yeah, no, it's definitely another kind of quick time, hand-to-hand combat kind of encounter. So I just kind of felt like the final encounter with the rival was just okay. Like, cinematically, it's cool. It was like not super satisfying to play.
Exactly, and the story wraps up in a pretty low-key way that it works, but it's kind of rehash of the second in a way where it's like, alright, Nate's with Elena now and he knows what's important. Again. And there's a hint with the ring, but it's an interesting way, like you mentioned, like at the end of the series at this point, it would be a strange thing, which it didn't seem like they ever had any intent to be fair.
So I think Uncharted 3, more so than any of the other games, is most obvious. This series reuses cliches. I kind of want your general thoughts on that because, we had the jungle zombies, and then you had the Fountain of Youth people, then you had like weird fire rug inspired djinns or whatever. Then like you said, you kind of have some of the same story beats as well. So I know you said that it's like kind of leaning into those tropes, but what are your thoughts when like the same franchise leans into those tropes multiple times?
Indiana Jones, for instance, I hate using the obvious comparison, but I feel like generally it does the same thing more or less, and I don't really tire of it in any of the movies. Some do some tropes better than others and all that, but I think especially being a video game, I do think there's certain expectations of where it may go, and you can change it up. You can do those twists, and for instance, Resident Evil 4 compared to Resident Evil 2, which are two games I grew up playing, very different in many ways, but just as good, if not better. However, for this particular series, I feel like it just works. I think I don't want to say why change the formula if it's not broken, but I had fun with it the first game. I have fun with it the third. I think the first does that twist, that particular twist, the best of the series, but a lot of that's because it's the first game in the series and you don't expect it as much. And this
Um,
one, especially I gotta give some credit because it's a hallucination. They don't actually see the jinns, or at least it's kind of implied that there's supernatural stuff, of course, with the weird fantasy, whatever, water or some shit. But I don't mind it. Fighting against the jinns, they're fun enemies, I think. You shoot them a few times and their head catches on fire, and then I think you gotta get a headshot. I kind of liked that. It was stressful and challenging, but in a good way. I didn't love it. I thought the other games did it better, but I definitely didn't see it as a weak point of the game. It definitely added to it in my enjoyment of it. It didn't take away. It wasn't the best
yeah,
example, but it was still fun.
yeah, I hear you. And hey, just like in the Last Crusade, um, right off in the distance, the desert on.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that wraps up Uncharted 3. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get in some behind the scenes stuff for Uncharted 4, if you're all right with that.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
I don't know how much you've looked into this, but I looked into quite a bit just because of the current controversy with Naughty Dog, which is something I've been following for a good 3 or 4 months now. But also, so the first three games, uh, Amy Hennig was a creative force, and she left under dubious circumstances. Allegedly, she was forced out. I don't know. I'm not claiming one way or another, so this is
Actually,
hearsay.
do know, so this will be interesting to talk.
I'm sorry. What was that?
Actually, do know, or I feel like I know more information than perhaps you do, so it'll be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of conflicting things here as well to take into account. So I always don't want to lean too far into one way. But interesting enough, some of the voice actors left the fourth game due to quote unquote weird story changes. Particularly Alan Tudyk had some pretty choice words about it. So this, like you said, was after the first Last of Us game, which I'm playing right now, and that's very important for playing this game and seeing how it was made. I think to play the two, because there's a
Mm,
lot of direct parallels. And
absolutely.
so the director of Uncharted 4 was the director of Uncharted 2. I forget his name, but it was also co-directed by Neil Druckmann, who did Last of Us, and so there's a different tone to it. I mean, it really feels like a reboot of the series, even though it is the last one. Originally,
Mhm.
the brother character was supposed to be one of the central villains, and then eventually he would come over to the good side, essentially like a character who wound up in the game and basically did some simple changes like that. But it seems like a lot of the story carried over. And do you have anything to add to that, or anything that you might have heard conflicting
No,
any of
you
that?
are pretty right about that. The original script kind of going to be Sam was seemingly going to be kind of a more of a retread of something that we kind of had before. Because I feel like even though the villain in Uncharted 3, she wasn't part of Nathan's like actual lineage or family or anything like that. Like new personal things about him and that kind of more intimate connection as a villain, even if it was kind of surface level sometimes. So I don't know if I would have liked the whole brother was a villain and then gets redeemed. I feel like they do it in a much more interesting way in the final product because brother is not a shining example of moral character. But he's also like not a straight up villain as well. And they do kind of fill that villain role with another character, still kind of carry over the themes of like jealousy and ambition and that. So I honestly, I really do think this is just not talking about the behind the scenes per se, but I really think if the Uncharted series had to have a fourth game, it was good that they had a kind of a story refresh. I think Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 are kind of rinse repeat. Like you said, the formula works and they lean into tropes in a healthy way, and that's good. Um, I think once you get to the fourth and something, you did make a trilogy. You get to the fourth and something, I feel like, it gets a little bit tiring if it would have been a lot of the same old stuff, which in some ways it is same old stuff in this game, but blown up even bigger. But I feel like there's a different, like you said, there's a different tone.
Yeah, and with storytelling, there's a rule of threes. Typically 3 act structure is the safest bet. There's a reason that trilogies tend to be generally well received, even though the third act is almost always seen as lesser, but not too much lesser in most
Mm.
instances. Typically, when you see an example of a fourth act in a story, or you see a fourth entry in a franchise, that's where it really can get shaky for a lot of series. Um,
Indiana Jones is one of those, so the
yeah,
comparisons continue, right?
exactly. So the thing with video games, though, is that they're not movies, they're not books. So you get a lot more leeway. It's like a fourth season of a TV show. Many of the fourth seasons of certain shows are the best or one of the best. So it's not quite the same. It's more episodic. It's almost like the fourth
Mm.
chapter in a serialized novel or something. So
Right.
this game, it feels much more like a reboot, which I think in many ways really helps the game with the next gen. It feels as though, in every way but the story, it feels as though you're going to be introduced to a reboot of the Uncharted franchise rather than just another entry. But it wound up being, for all intents and purposes, for right now, the final entry. We'll see. They'll want some of that Nathan Drake money eventually, even if he's not the
Yeah.
central protagonist.
Yeah. So did you want to talk about the behind the scenes stuff more before we get into the actual game?
Um, for this particular thing, I don't know, there's too much more other than that controversy, but I do think it's necessary to get into the immediate differences with this game. The one
Yeah.
story thing I will add, because I do think this is an important change that's interesting, is that uh, Elena was originally in the heist sequence at the game, where you're in the ballroom. There's a dance mechanic where you had to dance closer and closer to steal an artifact, which is an
Yes.
interesting, goofy gimmick that I think could have been fun. I hear that it was never quite perfected. I'm not heartbroken I didn't get to play it, but I do
Yeah.
think that Elena being there for the heist from the get-go would have definitely changed a lot structurally and with the character dynamics.
Yeah, I don't know if that would have quite worked or made sense with her character arc in this game, but that's good. That's interesting to know because I didn't know that. The only thing I would say to add to the behind the scenes stuff is like gaming journalism, like any field of journalism, is often a bit dramatized and sensationalized. Obviously, no one knows like the true intercompany dynamics of any game studio, right?
Yeah.
But basically, it actually recent developments have kind of clarified this a bit more too. I believe a couple journalists from IGN actually came forward recently and apologized for kind of succumbing to um, media peer pressure and basically mocking up the whole Naughty Dog conspiracy between Uncharted 3 and 4 as like a bigger deal than it was, where it wasn't necessarily that Amy Hennig was like forced out. It was not that dramatic. And Neil Druckmann and these other people had already been working at Naughty Dog for a long time, and it was more of a natural transition. And other things that support that too is that Amy Hennig has actually appeared with voice actors Nolan North and Troy Baker on their series of Let's Plays. The voice actors for these characters Let's Play their own games, which is kind of funny. And they've talked very candidly about the Uncharted franchise and how things changed in their lives and why different people did different things. So basically, the gaming media does this a lot, where the things were either falsified or completely overblown. So the whole internet outcry of those things kind of happening is it honestly just gets stale to me because I was a gaming journalist for a couple of years as a volunteer, and you see a lot of these stories, at least like falsified story structures, repeat themselves on Kotaku or IGN or what have you, and it honestly gets kind of annoying.
Yeah, I mean, I did see that stuff on Twitter where he apologized, and Neil and the other dude, he came back, and they were cool, and then that's nice, and I hope that's the truth, of course. I'd rather that the story be much more pleasant than, the worst case scenario. One thing that does shed
Yeah.
some doubt on that for me personally is just the recent developments, which do seem much more substantiated with the treatment of the employees more recently, particularly on Last of Us 2. Now
Oh well, yeah. See,
that could
that's a
be
whole different issue
exaggerated,
in
but
my
yeah,
opinion. Like creative differences and crunch are very different problems. Where a crunch is very real in pretty much every Western studio. When Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, Rockstar was the whole crunch
yeah,
conspirator, right? And I believe crunch happens in every freaking video game studio. I have no doubt about that.
yeah. It's really it's a sad, messed up thing. That's sad for me because, like Naughty Dog's a company I've always supported and enjoyed even since got back to my single digits, and to hear that they've succumbed to, even though it's different people running it, even from when Uncharted 1 came out to now, let alone when Crash Bandicoot 1 came out, it's still
Yeah.
disheartening and sad, and something. It's not the point of this particular video, but something worth mentioning for people to look further into and make up their own opinions on.
I'm sure crunch is a product of market, us as consumers, politics, executives, all that other crap too. Because like I feel like people have a tendency to kind of vilify like game director or the studio president when there's probably a lot more going on. And I think we can all agree that the game crunch is a huge issue because like, can you imagine working 80-hour work weeks like for months on end?
Exactly. I watched this documentary the other day on YouTube, just like a user submitted one, about the making of Spyro Legend of the Dragon, I believe it's called. It was a PS2 Spyro game. I actually owned it as a kid. And fascinating behind the scenes stuff where the company cut their health insurance and didn't tell them, the employees said. One dude that was like a manager, he was an alcoholic raging, and he got involved with a stripper. He was passed out drunk. She signed his home over. She forged his signature into her name, so he couldn't go to his own home while he was working that out and had to stay in the studio. Just the craziest stuff. And the gaming
Holy
industry
crap.
just, yeah. The game itself's not that interesting, but the behind the scenes stuff is some of the craziest, most interesting stuff I've ever heard. And
Yeah, the gaming industry definitely has some problems and needs to work out. I feel like of all industries that need unions, I think video games is probably at the freaking top of the list.
yeah,
Um,
but definitely not independent publishing houses that I may or may not run. That's
yeah.
they don't need it there. No,
We went into our social aspect of gaming. So yeah, time to talk about Uncharted 4 Thief's End. I really love this game, so I am very curious. As you might have been a little exhausted from Uncharted at this point because you played all these games very recently, very much in a row. So what was your thoughts?
yeah. So contextually, I played the second half of Uncharted 2, probably chapter 14 on, something like that, and then the after I beat that in a day or two, I beat Uncharted 3 in about 2 days. So yeah, I was pretty winded. I don't play games that much, really, especially not campaign games like this.
Mm.
So I was winded, and that is a huge factor for me in my experience with this game, which I will openly say. Have you seen the film Princess Mononoke?
Yes.
So when I first saw that, I watched with a ton of people, and they were asking me after, like, "How do you like it? How do you like the movie?" Same with Run Lola Run, another example of this. And I was like, I don't know, really didn't get much out of it, and they were upset, like offended, like I was talking about the movie. I was like, no, I'm just so tired that like you could be watching The Godfather and I wouldn't have liked it right now. I'm just not in the mood.
Right.
I'm too out of it. And I watched both those movies later and enjoyed them much more the second time. It's just that state of mind. And it's similar for this game. I did have some fatigue, but not too much. I was still open to the game. I spaced this one out over about a week or so, as opposed to like 2 or 3 days for the other games.
That's
Um,
good. Uncharted 4 is a longer game too. I feel like the first three games clock in all around kind of like 8 to 10 hours. Whereas Uncharted 4 is, for me, I think it was like a 16.
Possibly, yeah. I would say at least 12. I'd say it's at least a good 4 hours longer. So the first
Oh
thing with
yeah.
this game is I'm trying to think of gameplay stuff specifically. So you open on the boat, and you're driving the boat through the storm, and that's kind of fun. It kind of harkens back to the first game when you're on a boat, but now you're
Well,
driving it.
yeah, it does in media res again, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. So it is a trend in the series. Okay, I don't feel so stupid for saying that earlier now. It's just every even
No, that's funny.
numbered
Hey,
game.
at least the even numbered games did it. They still keep to the pattern.
Exactly. And so it does that, and that's fun. I recall. I remember it was a weird opening to the game. It is kind of strange, but I don't know. It's because it's not as even though it is a big deal, it's something about it feels a little undercooked compared to the previous two uh cold opens, in my opinion.
Yeah,
I don't know. It just wasn't as exciting, but it was still
because
cool.
you're with Sam at that point, and you don't really know why you care yet because he is a new character to this franchise.
Exactly, and you just don't like you're on a boat, but that's not exactly fighting 30 brawlers in a bar. It's not hanging off of a train. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah,
cool.
exactly.
The storm mechanics, I mean the graphics, that's really where the opening gets you is that it's just so well put together and so visually pleasing, I think. And the controls are so good that it wins you over with that.
No, I totally agree. There's something about the spectacle of Uncharted 4 in some moments is still very huge. Something about the spectacle does feel kind of more realistic. Like when a building collapses, like that building fucking collapses, like you might think it would. Or if you're caught in a storm, like you're caught in a storm, like that shit happens. Like I don't know. This game feels a little bit more grounded and a little bit more intimate with how you relate to Nate and control him and all those things.
Yeah. And so after then, I believe that we cut back to Nathan's childhood, if I'm not mistaken. There might be a sequence before them, but I feel like it goes right to the childhood.
Because there's several flashbacks of that throughout the game.
Yeah, and I think the first sequence where you do a little stealth thing, hardly at all. You just stealth around basically one nun, and then you sneak out a window and you meet up with your older brother who's introduced in the game. I think that and the platforming and the little tutorial that it does is one of the most charming moments in the entire franchise. I really love that stage. I think it's fun. The controls are great. The character animations of Nathan being more afraid and his brother leading him along, and you see the bad influence, but you see the love between the two brothers. It really shines. It's very Spielbergian, I felt.
Yeah.
Very naturally so as well. And you don't feel like the characters are shoehorned into the plot either, which is something worth mentioning. It feels natural, I think.
I was very curious to hear your thoughts on that because a lot of critics, maybe not necessarily critics, because critics pretty much adored Uncharted 4, but the minority of fans are pretty loud sometimes. So there was a lot of people who thought that Sam Drake, his brother, just felt completely out of nowhere and that he was like fabricated thing that didn't feel organic with the story. So it seems like you don't think that way.
I don't, but I also knew what I was signing up for when I played the game too. So I will say
Oh
there's a
yeah.
bit
Well, I
of
mean, most people did. He was very prevalent in like marketing and trailers and stuff that you were learning more information about Nate's past and along that nature.
I suppose what I mean though is that like I didn't play the first game when it came out and then have a long history and a context that this new introduction of a character would fit into. Like I knew before I played the first game there's going to be a brother character later on. And it's kind of a big
Yeah.
trope. I love the show The Sopranos, but there's kind of a joke about how almost every season has a character that's never been mentioned before on the show getting out of jail, who's then the central antagonist of the season.
Oh, nice.
And it's once again it's one of those tropes in this kind of storytelling. I can see Indiana Jones having that if they ever wanted to, or if they made more of those movies when they still had the time to. So
Yeah.
I don't really mind it, and I think it's more importantly than the idea. I think it's very well done in execution.
But yeah, I really agree. I think the writing and the banter between Nate and Sam is really good. Um, the acting is probably at the highest caliber in Uncharted 4 as well. And they really get a lot of mileage out of that relationship. And yeah, it's really cool because they can kind of explore smaller moments, like this beginning of the game where he's leading him across rooftops and stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's a big difference in this game and the others is that it definitely puts a lot more attention on the characters and the story. I talked earlier about the gradient from the first game to the last, where it's almost all game and then it becomes almost all story. And in this one, I definitely think it's the most cinematic of the series. It's the most story and character driven. Um, and going to something else that's new and different in this game, and there's a lot more new in this game than the third game, for instance, which people said was basically the second one, but a little more refined.
Absolutely.
A lot more mechanics, just a different look. Like you said, it's PS4 native, which is a huge factor, especially graphics wise. Once again, the controls are much better than the third game. The best of the series, the smoothest, the most dynamic. Ironically, though, there's also the most points where, like, I went to do one thing and Nathan would do another. I'm like, what the fuck? And then die. But that's probably just my experience as a gamer. I'm not going to act as an objective flaw and not my own foolery. But,
Could go either way.
yeah. Yeah, you go
That's
to
very
jump and he
funny.
winds up hanging off the side of the building, like, no! And you get shot and it's all over.
I still do that in games in 2020. I was just playing Last of Us 2, and that's happened a few times where it's like same button was mapped to like melee attack someone, but if you had your gun out to like switch which shoulder you were looking over, and so instead of like hitting a character, I was just changing the camera. I like died because I was a dumbass. So it was like partially because why is this button mapped to these two drastically different things? Also, I was an idiot.
That's fine, and that's relevant too because Uncharted. One of the things I love the most about the games and its controls is the button you use to do which shoulder you're looking over to aim a gun. So if you're around the walls on your right that you're hugging, you could hit a button, and then you'll look over your left shoulder, so you get a bit more reach and can get people that way. Which ironically, in the first three games, was the same button, and this as well as a reload button was the same button through that trilogy. And in this game, they changed both those buttons for no real apparent reason. It's not really one way or another, but it is an adjustment that I had to make the first level or two of the game.
Yeah, since I played this game like 4 years ago, it's not something I inherently remember. So I'm glad that you bring it up because like some of those like weird control specificities you kind of forget with time. Just like the moments in a game you necessarily won't. But yeah, no, like I don't even remember that.
It's such a minor point, and you acclimate to it pretty quickly. It's not anything, ridiculous where it's like, you have to tap the controller to use the flashlight to make it shake. You don't have to do that to reload or something insane. It's just like triangle instead of R1 or whatever. But yeah, one of the big things that the game immediately does is that you have a stage where you're underwater as Nathan, and then you find out that he's just working
And
basically a
day
construction job.
Yeah, so they really give you like a slice of life for Nate pretty early on where you're like swimming underwater leisurely, making dinner with Elena, you're playing Crash Bandicoot, you're doing all this shit for a good portion of time, which I kind of appreciate because the theme of the game overall is kind of like longing for adventure. I feel like you kind of need this gaming downtime to make the player kind of feel the same way. Some people are, more, opinionated about that. But what did I feel like to you?
I hated it.
Yeah,
I get
yeah.
what they were doing. I respect
I
it
think like you're
conceptually.
designed to hate it to an extent, though.
And I do get that, and I get it's well designed in many ways. It's well done. Once again, I mean, I was playing these games, with this game particularly with a deadline as well. So like where you're like looking around at Nate's attic, and you could get a little Nerf gun and you could shoot the targets. That's fun and all that. But it's harder to appreciate it when you do have a time limit. You know what I mean? And I think that could
Yeah.
be
So
definitely
what
a
you're saying
factor.
is this is all your fault.
Yeah. Um, It's stuff like that, stuff like being on the dock and like walk over here to talk to your boss, press X to sign the paperwork. I get that it's meant to be mundane, but I also don't always know that intent means
Yeah.
success, and I get how it could work for some people. It really didn't work for me. Most of it fell flat. Or like, you're talking to Elena, and you could hit X or Y for a dialogue prompt in terms of you drift off and you forget you don't hear what she's talking about, and you have to take a guess. It's a cute little thing. It's kind of funny, but it really doesn't add anything to the game. I really think the Crash Bandicoot level, which is a fan favorite thing that they did, I really felt it was egregious and kind of just indulgent, and once again
Oh,
adds absolutely
it's
nothing to
very
the game.
indulgent
It's
because they
cute.
do it
Their
again later
banter
too.
their banter's fun while they're playing it, but I kind of feel like I bought this game to play an Uncharted game, and for the first real bit of it, you're not. And I get what they're doing. I respect it creatively, but it just didn't
Hmm.
work for me. Maybe I'll replay it with more time on my hands, and I will appreciate those details. But on a first play, it really felt like it just distracted and dragged it down more than anything.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a totally fair opinion. The way I look at that kind of portion of the game is that it's basically just being a movie for a little while. Where you kind of you're turning your gameplay brain off to such an extent where all you do is press X and move your control stick a little bit. So I kind of forgive it because at that point I don't even really see it as a game, even though it still is a video game. Um, but since it's an excuse to kind of explore the characters in a slightly different light, it doesn't really bother me. But I can see why it bothers other people.
Yeah, in a storytelling way, I definitely get it. I definitely think it's subjective. And I guess my thing is, and this is really a big issue I have with this game, is that, like you said, it's really just a movie at that point. I feel like up until this game, there was always a balance where it was equal parts movie or game, or if it was in favor of one, it would always be in favor of the game. And especially the first hour or so of this game, it really goes over the other direction.
Yeah, because there is a part of this game pretty much once you get to the island, which is basically where you spend half of the game. Once you get there, I feel like gameplay and cinematics kind of balance each other out. Until that kind of second half of the game, it really is a lot of storytelling. Because, like you said, even ballroom party scene, which I actually love, I think it's super charming. One cut that stands out to me, like when Nate is like slipping off an edge of the building or whatever, he didn't quite make a jump perfect, and then it like passes back to Sully just whining and dining in the party. It's like stuff like that's really charming to me. And that's very obvious that they were trying to play up cinematics of the game the first several hours in all of its different set pieces.
Definitely, the ballroom sequence is really fun. It's really well done. The dialogue is better than it ever was. The storytelling's better than it ever was. And that's one reason I want to bring up Amy Hennig leaving. Is that, I mean, obviously I'm a fan of her work. I really enjoy the first three games, but it
Mm.
definitely gives it a breath of fresh life to get a different eye. And having the director of Uncharted 2 direct this as well keeps it familiar, but yeah, there's a new polish on it. There's some new equipment under the hood. Um, and I think that those core strengths, at least with the aesthetics of the game, are just better looking and smoother than they've ever been.
Absolutely. I think that comes down to even the mechanics. You have little things that don't feel too major, but they really help the environments feel more lived in. With like playing around with rope that you can throw and climb, or sliding down mudslides and all that stuff. They're mechanics that aren't used a whole terrible amount. Just having that slightly more flexible movement across the terrain is pretty good.
Yeah, I think the platforming, particularly like the climbing, is the best that this series has to offer. Probably. Um,
Yeah.
I is definitely the best in terms of pure controls and playability. It's definitely the smoothest. I love the reaching mechanic, which I think he does in all the games, but especially in this one. Like you move the joystick and he moves his hand to kind of look for somewhere he could grab a hold of, and it's very intuitive. There's not many moments where like, what the hell? I clearly was set up here, but it's also not holding your
Hmm.
hand through it like the first game. In terms
Yeah.
of the new devices used, I'm glad you kind of transitioned into that because so getting into The Last of Us, which I've just started playing, I'm maybe 2 or 3 hours into it at this point, I'd say. Um, it feels like they added some things from that into this game, and I think that they were much better suited in Last of Us, where it makes sense why you would look around and put a ladder up against a building to get up in this post-apocalyptic area. I felt like a lot of this
I
game was looking
hated.
for.
I hate doing that shit in The Last of Us, though. I'm not gonna lie.
I'm not a fan of it, but at least it kind of makes sense, like in terms of like story and you know what I mean. Like I get why in that environment you would
Yeah,
have to
it's a
do those
slower paced,
things.
methodical. Watch your step. Do things the right way. Whereas Charge is more fast and loose.
Exactly, and that is a big thing with this game is that it's the series has a pace that you're used to. It has a style that you're used to. So in this game, when you go from falling out of an airplane on a crate to pushing a crate time after time after time, and you do that and you use the rope to swing, and sometimes you even get to use your rope to push a crate if it's in the water. And it gets to a point where it's like, god damn, like moving a fucking box is not the most exciting thing I've done as this character.
No, it's not. You do it so often in some of these games where it's like, okay, is this like supposed to be a puzzle? Is this supposed to challenge me in some way? It's
Yeah,
like, okay, yeah, maybe it makes sense that these characters would have to do this in real life. Goddamn, why do I have to keep doing it?
exactly. The first time or two, it's not be the rope. I like the rope. I like you brought up sliding. That's fun. It's like stressful in a good way. Um,
Mhm.
and especially with
It tests your
sliding,
reflexes in a different way.
especially like you're like sliding and then you have to jump and then use the rope to swing. I think that's very satisfying. They have it
Yeah.
matched up pretty well with the auto, basically the auto lock where you go with a certain radius and you could use the rope. Um, but those boxes just killed me. For it's mostly the first half of the game. After the first half of the game, it definitely picks up and is more the typical fanfare you'd expect. But
Yeah.
they were just doing some real box pushing fan service for a bit.
Those box pushing fans, they need their content. They cry for it.
There's an interesting game. This is off topic, but a game called Catherine, where you dream that you're like a goat and you have to move squares or whatever to climb up before.
I haven't played the game, but I know what you're talking about. It's like box pushing and pulling the puzzle game.
Yeah, that actually was a really fun game with that mechanic. I really like that game. But that's all. I'll leave
Yeah,
it
well,
at that
because
because
it's
it's a
more
separate
focused
topic.
on like the physical space of like you have to move all of these elements around to like continue progressing. Like that's very much the core design of the game.
Exactly, and
But
this it's just kind of shoehorned in there, in my opinion.
it pretty much is. There's still so many memorable set pieces in this game. I enjoy, if like you're in Norway or something, but like you're kind of in like a very cool temperate area, and it's like Rafe and his guys are like blowing some cave to hell. Nate and Sam are actually, investigating things and trying to figure out like these light puzzles and all that to the next clue. And there's a lot of scenarios where Nate and Sam like do things. I think they're in Madagascar, and then they like explore that area. Just like the first time where Naughty Dog basically toyed with the idea of like semi open world areas in a few of the chapters. That Madagascar section, especially, where you can like drive your little Jeep around and like kind of go wherever you want for a little bit, like explore more than you would in the other game.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the Jeep's fun. I like the Jeep. I like the I forget what you call it exactly. The rope in the front of the Jeep you could tie around somewhere. It's kind of nice that it lets you walk around and then hit, I think, triangle to snap the bungee to attach it to a tree
Yeah.
or whatever. There's one good jump scare kind of deal where you're doing that. You have around a tree and there's a boulder, but then you get hit by the boulder and you get swept off the hill you're climbing over a mountain, and you have to drive up at basically a 90-degree angle. But the way that they do it so smooth,
Right.
it feels like you just got killed, like you fucked up. But then you immediately realize, like, oh wait, this is part of the game. I'm supposed to do this.
That's right. That is freaky. I remember that.
Yeah, it's funny because I was looking up some reviews at this point in the series and comparisons, and that was one of the few things that was really spoiled for me about this game, and it still got me even when I was playing it. It's just a really well executed little I don't know what you call it, just a little set piece, I guess you could say.
Yeah, because like you just don't expect it, and then like you know what it feels like to fuck up and die and shit. So like when an animation of that sort starts to play, it's like totally in the mind that you screwed up. And then it's like, oh, you're still going. I guess I didn't. This is scripted, and Naughty Dog does that pretty well, especially in some of their last couple games.
Especially I think there's a point. It might be at that part. It might be after. There's a few points where I believe where you're basically in that situation where Nate has to like climb up the Jeep to get back in the driver's seat. It's pretty tense.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a few of those moments, and I always appreciate them because they definitely break up the pace in an exciting way.
Exactly. One thing I think is funny is when you're climbing, you have a partner. You can climb along just the general terrain that you would, but if they're in your way, you can climb onto their shoulders and just like use them as something to hold on to. And it doesn't affect the gameplay. You don't get any alternate paths or anything, but it's just a funny picture to have like 80-pound Elena, and then Nate's just like hanging on to her shoulders, his full body weight on her, and they're like 1,000 feet in the air.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments in the game is when you do like the whole bell tower puzzle, whatever, which I actually think is a pretty cool puzzle in the game, even though you do kind of have to keep flipping through Nate's journal, which I like Nate's journal as a storytelling piece, but then it's also kind of like a puzzle solving piece in this game specifically. Then you do that whole sequence, and you have that crazy motorcycle chase through like the town area and everything. That might be my favorite like vehicle sequence in these games. And like after the excitement of all that, you get your first real story gut punch where Elena, you find out that she figured out that Nate is doing all this crap behind her back. Like that was the first moment in this franchise where I actually felt pretty significant emotion, because like even when Sally dies, it's like, no, like I can imagine this being fake, or I never really had much stress over the characters, their relationships suffering. That was like the first time where I was like, oh man, this game is definitely on a different level emotionally than the other three games.
Yeah, it definitely puts a lot more into the quiet moments, and like you said, just the characters. You have things where it's like, oh, well, I'm worried about Nate and Elena's relationship, whereas that's really just kind of something hinted at in the other games. This gets much further into it, and there's a lot of moments in this game where the characters are just talking. You're in a Jeep and they have dialogue bits, and some of it's humorous, some of it's exposition, some of it's just banter. But that stuff's always pretty nice. That's always something that the games have had a little bit of, but this one really indulges in it.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think it does so really well. Um, yeah, and then do you have anything to say about like the first half of the game before you get to like the pirate island?
Yeah, like I said, the pacing's definitely different. It does take a while to start up. Particularly the introduction of the one character, I forget her name now, but the kind of villain kind of character.
Oh, Nadine.
Nadine, thank you. Yeah, that kind of sucks because the series has strong female characters and likable supporting female characters up until that point. without it ever being shoehorned in. I mean, the series was run by a woman, and then in this one you get this woman who's, you know, she looks real thin, but for some reason she beats the fuck out of anybody effortlessly. But in the very last game, you beat up guys who were like weighed as much as three of her. And I know
Mm.
Nate's a little rusty, but like by pure body mass alone, it's just so over the top. And in my opinion, she's such a one-dimensional character in a series that doesn't have as much of that, that it's kind of
Mm.
disappointing.
I think she has really good fight scenes in this game, especially the one where you fight her on like the multi-story, like dilapidated building on the island. That's one of my favorite parts of the game. But
That
yeah, I do admit she doesn't really have a lot of character in Uncharted 4. Just kind of an obstacle. And I guess they kind of had to have her as like, an explanatory means of like why Wraith has so much muscle because they're like pirates for some reason. Like she contracts basically a whole military out to go fuck you up. I will say though, and I know you didn't play it, you definitely don't have to because it has pretty much nothing to do with the Nathan Drake story. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy definitely actually explores her character in a more interesting way. The Lost Legacy is basically the Chloe Nadine game slash story. So for people who want that, The Lost Legacy does give those characters the spotlight in a really nice way because they don't really get the spotlight in 4. I mean, Chloe's pretty much absent completely.
Yeah, I don't think she's in four
So
at
for
all.
people who want more of that, Lost Legacy is pretty much a must-have, but it's totally like, you know, completely spin-off material.
Yeah, it's one of those things to me. It's like it's not a huge issue. It's just that it's like so unbelievable for, like you said, a series that kind of puts self believability where like Nate and his brother Sam are just fighting this woman and they can't even get a punch in on her, and they're acting like she's the Hulk, and it's like, what is this? Why? This is ridiculous.
It is kind of played for humor, and I do think it's kind of funny. Maybe not for all the right reasons, but yeah, just because it's really ridiculous.
But it's just one of those things where it's like it does characters so well that having one like that who isn't just a villain that's going to get killed off immediately, once you have to hit the quick time buttons. It was just kind of strange and jarring and out of place. Like you said, the games do always have a secondary villain anyhow. Just the inclusion of her just felt weirdly shoehorned in, and I do wonder if Sam was
Well,
in
and
that
she's the only
role.
one who doesn't die. Like every other primary and secondary villain definitely gets wiped out by the end of their respective games.
Exactly, yeah, and so she really sticks out in that way too. Which when she has a bit of the issues with the antagonist who you do end up fighting at the end, it's a little bit more
I mean,
interesting and likable, I think, when she's like, I don't want my men to die. We've wasted enough resources, and then she just fucks off, and
exactly. I do like she's basically a foil to the primary villain. Really, other Uncharted games, like the secondary villain is just kind of like a henchman to the main villain, or like in the first game, the secondary villain becomes the main villain. Um, like in the third game, secondary villain is totally just a henchman of the villainess. He doesn't really have anything going on. Where she has, I guess, a little bit more going on, but when you're first introduced to her, she's basically just like Hulk and she kicks your ass, which I guess is just kind of a foil to Rafe being a rich pussy.
yeah, I mean, I guess I would have been fine with her being in more of the game or just explored more. I don't know. It's just her inclusion felt weird, and that was one of the big changes story wise from the original draft that I think maybe was rushed because of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I can hear you.
But moving forward to the second half of the game, which we'll say is the cutoff after the in media res opening.
Yes.
It gets, like you said, pretty open world with the boat, for instance, where you're looking around the island. The clock tower puzzle is definitely a highlight of the series. Not only the puzzle itself, which I found a lot of fun, because I love when puzzles incorporate different events of gameplay. So a lot of it's platforming, but it's also looking at your journal and stuff. So it's not too repetitious. It's not because there are a lot of puzzles in this game, some really good ones, as well, and I'm not much of a puzzle guy, but there were some I genuinely enjoyed playing through, and the clock one was probably my favorite. But then, of course, you get the downfall where the building just kind of falls apart, which is a really exciting set piece.
Oh yeah, there's like the kinetic energy of like that moment in particular is so good, and it's like so much tracking shots. It's there's really no cuts, and you're always following Nate and Sam. They're like sliding down the building, like punching through a window on like that's below them. And all of that is just so seamless. So it makes it feel more frantic than perhaps like some of the set pieces did in previous games. This doesn't say that the other set pieces were bad, but there's something about like dynamic fluidity of the camera in Uncharted 4 that makes it feel more up close and personal.
Yeah, it's definitely a more visceral game. You definitely feel the next generation's capabilities.
Mm.
Another moment of that for me was when you're getting dragged behind the car on the ground and you gotta like climb your way up. And then is it the typical thing where you just fight from truck to truck for a bit? But that beginning part, especially where you're getting dragged along the road, is pretty wild.
It's very wild. They set up a lot of interesting action moments all on this island, and like island has such a character to it because I feel like this is where the game really hits its stride, both in terms of story and gameplay. Mixing all of the gunplay and the platforming, the climbing, and the other terrain, and then you're pretty evenly interspersed with the cutscenes. Like they usually always hit really hard. I remembered being super, you know, it's kind of like can't wait to find out what happens next when you realize that like Sam and Rafe are kind of working together in a way. And then like Nate gets shot and then falls off the cliff, like betrayal, and then that immediate physical plummet to like the riverbed. Like, that sucked.
No, that's a pretty interesting bit of the game because once again you're just like basically crippled as Nate. You're moving slower. It's hard to climb up things. It's raining on you. It just feels desperate and miserable as you're playing it.
It does, and then that leads into like the final, which is a flashbacks too. You kind of understand their namesake, like who they are as kids, and their ambition, and they're Nathan and Sam Morgan. They're not even Drake's. Like that really ties into the whole thematics of the series for me. They're always seeking to find something greater and be greater and all of that, which you can be greater without your namesake. But and then obviously that's part of the message. But I felt like that was an important moment, and a lot of people were like, "That's a retcon. He's a Drake. He's related to Sir Francis Drake." And it's like, to me, that's never what the series was about. It's like being related to like some famous ancestor. It's like obviously he's incredible shit, regardless of who his ancestors are.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe that retcon, if you can call it that, was made in the third game anyways. Um,
It pretty much was, and the whole rejection of, what, I don't need that ring, let it sink into the quicksand, all that shit. It was basically saying the same message. I think this game just like it's that theme a little bit harder, especially with brother character.
yeah, like he was
But
already
yeah,
known to be an orphan.
people consider it a retcon, but I don't think they're really paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, I get why it is a change, and maybe some people prefer the one side of it. I could see that as personal preference, but once again, I just don't give that much of a crap. It's just not that big of a deal. It's not Star Wars for me or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What do you think about the whole section of the game where Lena is the one to find you and patch you up, and then you kind of have to have this like awkward marital mending? while you are also like gunning people down and like still continuing your adventure.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously that plot convenience that she finds you and all that. I don't mind that. Once again, it's a video game. Who cares? Um, but it's nice to have her in the game because up till that point, you don't know if she will join you or not. Um, you don't imagine it ends in them getting divorced or where like Nathan Drake makes it safely home and then Elena's packed her things already. But
Yeah, that would be quite the dark turn.
but it's so nice to see her, and then their dialogue and all that, and you get a lot of nice character moments while you're also fighting people and driving around. With a pretty long level, as I recall, you're using this elevator system as well on the island that the pirates have made.
One of my favorite moments on Uncharted 4. It's a very much a cinematic moment. It's after you ride one of the elevators and like you get back in your Jeep, like trying to like figure out how they hurt each other, and they're like trying to figure out their emotions and all this. And like they just like spend like 2 minutes in silence. Just like you said, this game very much indulges in the banter while you're playing the game. Then there's like this light piano song that just kind of chimes in, and then you're just driving the Jeep for like 2 minutes. And it's kind of like this moment of clarity. No one's trying to gun you down and all of that. I just thought that was like one of the most beautiful, quiet moments in any game, honestly.
Yeah, when I played that scene, it wasn't a piano song. They were playing DMX for some reason.
Oh, that's too bad.
And I remember I didn't take my earbuds out, but it was still emotional, just in a different way.
Very different way.
Um, yeah, it does that stuff really well. It really gets into Nate and Elena's relationship. They do a fake out death with her for just a moment. Um, and ultimately,
Serious.
oh sorry.
Fake death.
Ultimately, you get to a point where Nate's story is essentially over, and he has completely converted his character arc of caring more about people than the treasure, and he doesn't need it. Which a part of me honestly feels like is kind of repeating the lesson he learned in the third game, where he's like, okay, I don't need the treasure, I have my family. And that's what made it clever with getting his brother in to get him back into that. But I feel like by the end it is a little bit samey with that message, but who cares, whatever. That's not a huge deal breaker for me. But his brother Sam
is true though, because like there's that crucial moment where they reunite with Sully and like they're all ready to go. And Sam is that old Nathan where he just can't let it go. They are this close to the whole pirate treasure. And I think the clever twist on that this time, that Nate goes back not because he wants to see the treasure per se, or wants it over the other thing, but because it's kind of the brother's keeper thing. Even though that you fucked me over earlier on, still that desire to make sure that his brother is okay. I felt like was a really powerful twist on that. This makes it very different from the third game.
Exactly. I totally agree with that part of it. And then at that point in it, you get into some platforming. Essentially, you're going through. I think most of it's just caves for the rest of the game. Essentially, at that point.
Oh yeah, I love it. Like the environmental design is just so good. I like the lighting, all the like stalactites and stuff as you're like rappelling down into the cavern with the pirate ship. It builds up the intrigue and the dread so well because it's basically just silence until you get there. There's no big like shootout. There's no big like you're shooting all of these supernatural creatures before the final encounter, which I do really appreciate because like for 3 games in a row they did that where it's like dealing with these crazy supernatural threats. And this time in this game, none of that. Like this is literally just old pirate's treasure. There's no like super specter like hanging around it. It's just all of these different people trying to get it.
Yeah, and I think that's fine that they do without it in this game. I think like would it be cool to get some pirate ghosts or something like that? Sure, but it's not necessary. The game doesn't need it either. And the platforming's really great in the last act of the game. The environments, like you said, are very well done. You feel like you're exploring a cave. It's fun. It's visually engaging. You're into the story, and you really, I feel like you don't actually know what's gonna happen at this point. Like it could go a few different ways at the very least. Like you feel like Nate's gonna make it out, but his brother on the other hand, you really don't know. You really don't know what's gonna
Yeah.
happen with the villain, and Nadine is still associated with him at that point. And so essentially, you just platform your way over to the pirate ship, and I don't even know there's that many enemies or another fight at all up until that point. I feel like there's one, but not a huge one, comparatively speaking. And I do
Yeah.
want to point out, I do think the shootouts in this game are much, much improved from the third. The stealth is like worlds better than the second and third game. It's actually a
Yeah, because
very
there's
useful
actually like
mechanic.
mechanics where you can like mark enemies, and then like you kind of know if they see you. Like there's definitely more thought put into it.
Exactly, and it changes the way you play the game. Like I think they lean a little too heavy into it in certain areas where you basically have to stealth your way through it. But that's not that big of a deal. There's a lot of games where you have to do it for a certain point. Um,
Mm.
I'm not as in love with the shooting in this one as I was the first two. I think it's much smoother. I think that it's more well defined and everything. I just didn't particularly enjoy it or feel as engaged as I was with those, which could have been Burnout. But I just feel like the levels themselves and designs and structures and environments just weren't as fun. But they really did improve it from the third game, in my opinion.
Yeah. It'd be hard to say if it's Burnout because like typically I like the mechanics as they progress through the series, but I played all four games probably within like 2 months. I actually played the trilogy like August of 2016, and then like a few weeks later, I played four in like September of that year or something. So I kind of did what you did, where it was definitely kind of like a journey of playing.
But yeah, so the final boss fight, yeah, we forgot to mention the third game. It's a quick time ending, of course, and this one's
Yeah.
essentially the same way. It's interesting because it's basically an entirely new game mechanic, which I don't appreciate. Where it's cool in concept where you have a sword fight. If it's a movie, it'd be cool, but it's kind of just strange to be honest. Story wise, environmentally, you're trapped in a cabin, or you're trapped in like a lower cabin in the pirate ship. It's on fire.
Mhm.
Sam's trapped behind a fallen beam. All that stuff's really cool. Um, but it's kind of, I don't know, the fight itself was just kind of awkward for me.
Yeah, I can kind of see that too. Like my brother's better at these games, and he had no problem with it. I do respect it more than the quick time endings because it is kind of an evolution of hand to hand combat with like how it controls and how you dodge and stuff. Would need to play it again too because again it's been a while. So I respect it more in that there's more thoughtful design behind it. Um, not gonna lie, I kind of sucked at it because it is like a totally new mechanic thrown in at the last second.
Exactly, and it is a little intuitive because you're used to quick time events, you're used to hand to hand combat. But I still got like nicked. I don't think I ever died, but I got nicked a lot more times than I probably needed to, just on the pure grounds of like, you know, triangle to dodge right, square to dodge left, or whatever it was. And
What do you think about Rafe as a villain? Do you think he's like the strongest villain in the series?
I could see that argument. I liked him as a villain. He was fine. He had a lot more character than the other ones, I think. He had a lot more development too. I definitely like the final ending and how that confrontation goes story wise and with his character. I still think I kind of like Lavarovich, or whatever the hell he's called in the second game best. And a
Yeah.
lot of that does boil down to, I hate to say it, he has multiple boss battles with him where he's at least like, you know, commanding other people. He's built up. He has the best final boss fight in the whole game.
Yeah.
And so those factors are a big. They come into play quite a bit for me. And he was the most threatening, to be honest, because there's points where he's holding people captive and all that. That really, it felt like he could have snapped and just killed any character at any point. Even the ones you knew were safe, you could feel like he could have done that or would have done that. This character, I like that
Yeah.
he's kind of a bitch. I like that he's kind of a pretty boy. He wants to be Nathan Drake, but he doesn't have that. I thought it was all well done. I don't know if he's like, favorite. He may not be my favorite, but I definitely think that he's just as good as any villain in the series.
Yeah. Yeah, I just appreciate that Sam is kind of a foil of his brother in some ways, and then Rafe is kind of a foil of Nathan and Sam, but in different ways. I feel like the trifecta of the characters work more logically together than perhaps some of the like cliche villains of the past games. He's not like all time great villain or anything, but he seems to be me a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, they
What we've
definitely
got.
flesh him out more.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think? Because like I know some people, kind of me included, one of my favorite video game endings is Uncharted 4 and how they wrap up the whole series. So do you expect Nate to actually be able to save Sam?
Yeah, so that part I really loved because it was pretty scary. I didn't think it would happen. And the way they did, it's a cop out. It's a total cop out where they want a happy ending. They want the tension. It's like Toy Story 3. The thing is,
It
just like
is.
Toy Story 3, it's incredibly clever and well done and logical and satisfying.
Yeah, it's like yeah, it pretty much is like that because like situation is gone to shit, and it's like in the moment, like I feel like everybody thinks Sam is not gonna make it because the whole ship is on fire. It's crumbling around down around them. You have a pretty good feeling that maybe Nate will make it out, probably. Yeah, like Story 3, you have the crane, and then like here it's like, oh, this cannon still works. All right, we're good to go.
Exactly, and that's the nature of Uncharted too. You know what I mean? Like them being in a situation that's
Mm.
increasingly worse and worse and worse until something finally just gives. That's really the structure of every encounter in the game, essentially. So I don't think it's a cheat. I think it's conventional. I think it's a little bit predictable, but in a good way. Where like I always say, good storytelling is when you know what's going to happen, but you're just as invested. And
But at the same time, you like you said, like first time, like we didn't really know what was going to happen. Like I totally was like, Sam might die here. Like he doesn't need to live.
yeah, yeah, I agree. There's definitely a little bit more of a gray area in that one. Like I
Yeah,
definitely felt
whereas
like there
like
was a
all the
bit of
beloved
plot
Toy Story
armor.
characters were like, all right, they can't kill these guys. Like holy shit.
Yeah, like I feel like the same was a bit of plot armor, but it definitely could have gone either way. Um, but once it happens, like, oh yeah, of course they saved him, and I was cool with that. I was happy they did. So that part of the ending I really enjoyed. I thought it was pretty much immaculately done, story
Yeah,
wise and
one
all that.
of my favorite shots in games ever is like when you are swimming away and you see the pirate ship just explode so fantastically, and it's kind of like illuminated by like the opening of the cave where the sun coming in, and like God, that is so amazingly beautiful. I freaking love that shit.
Did you know in that shot that if you zoom in towards the door, like there's like an open door up on one of the higher levels, you actually see Jack from Jack and Daxter watching Nathan and Sam leave?
Yeah, I know you're memeing on me, but that kind of is a commentary on how often Naughty Dog puts these damn Jack and Daxter Easter eggs, like they're like literal eggs, the precursor eggs from those damn games. They like hide them as artifacts in the Uncharted series, like every fucking game.
That's funny.
It is funny. Yeah, Naughty Dog's pretty indulgent with their references and shit.
Yeah, I
Which
catch on to
leads
some of them.
to their that leads into their daughter playing Crash Bandicoot. Didn't you love that a second time?
Yeah, it was just as worthless a second time I felt. Um, the beginning where I understood on a story level why we had all that stuff, even though I didn't particularly like it as a gamer or either person playing the game, will put it that way. I felt like the epilogue was completely unnecessary and oddly enough resolved a lot of plot threads that never existed in the franchise. where it introduced conflicts and immediately resolved them as we're being introduced to them in a really awkward and strange way.
How do you mean?
So like there's this whole weird thing where so far there's really no thematic or structural relevance of the epilogue to the game. Like it feels like it was essentially like a year after the game came out, they had a DLC level and that's what it was or something, because there's no hint about, you know, Nate and I just forgot what I said, Evelyn. That's really funny. And what's I forget your
You're
name now.
right. Nate never talked about having a kid.
Nate and his wife. Yeah, I don't remember them ever talking about having a kid or anything. They don't have a baby. So you have this new character introduced that's his daughter, and it does this whole plot about her finding out who her parents are, and them being like, "Oh, is it too soon?" and all that. I guess we'll explain a little bit, and it's just kind of weird because it's just like this has nothing to do with anything else that we've ever seen in this franchise. With them being
Yeah,
parents
I
or them hiding their
completely disagree.
past, it's just kind of thrown in there, I feel. And now some of the stuff like, you know, their life and them owning the company and all that, Sully and Sam coming to visit, all that stuff is charming and it's nice. You're happy they have this happy life. But I felt like all the stuff with the daughter and her finding who her parents are is really just strange, and it's a total fourth act.
Yeah, well, to me, thing as her just kind of a win, right? Because the whole Uncharted 4 story, like this is like the last adventure that really tests Nate's loyalty to Elena. That, you know, is the final test of whether he appreciates family more than the thrill of it. And I think just knowing that they have a family and they have a child is kind of like that victory for that story. But also B, her finding out that they're freaking crazy adventure people is it's like the way of, I guess, telling the audience that it could have both, but like moderation was key, which is like the whole thing that Nate never really understood, like the franchise leading up to this epilogue. Is Elena is like no like slouch. Like obviously in the very first game, it started with her as like a documentary crew with his like discovery on the boat, right? So I like it a lot because it kind of ties all the themes together, at least for me.
See, and I get what you're saying with all that. I just think that those particular themes could have been communicated much more efficiently. So
And
like,
hey, it's hard to know. Maybe they introduced their daughter because the Uncharted series will continue someday, but with her as the lead.
yeah, and they could do that, and I think like on its own, that's fine. You know, like Nate having a daughter and all that, and that history, I'm fine with that as a plot thing on its own. But for this particular game, it feels unnecessarily tacked on. Whereas I think if they did a more conventional epilogue with the characters that we already have, and it could be playable or it could just be a cutscene. Even you could show them having a baby, or you could show them maybe with a child that's a little bit more grown up. What I would have done was bring back I can't remember her name anymore. The E word, Nate's wife's old documentary. She has a new show that she's financing with her riches, and Nate's on it. And
Yeah,
it follows his career, and they do it together as a family, almost like a Steve Irwin kind of thing. And how
just
his whole
kind of what they
family.
do, I guess, Elena and Nate, because it's kind of
Yeah,
you don't really have a super firm grasp of like what it is that it's like because they're kind of like yeah, they're kind of like keeping a record of their adventures. You don't really know how that form that takes place. Like is the Nate and Elena special streaming on Netflix? Like I don't know.
yeah, exactly. I guess I just don't feel like I have to play 20 minutes of this new character at the end of the game and be introduced to, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
All that stuff. I
yeah,
feel
I
like
was
that
kind
was
of
too
hinting
much.
towards this earlier when you know you actually really love it in this context because you get so much environmental storytelling of like years of their lives have gone by and you discover that as their daughter. I actually really enjoy just walking around and pressing X or whatever. And there's a lot of storytelling to be had. because it's just kind of environmental stuff. It's tertiary. It's not the main arc of the story. It's to me, it's just fascinating to learn about a world in that lens. But again, they don't always do it perfectly well. Like some of the stuff in Uncharted 3 where you did that, it was kind of boring in the world that you were, walking around wasn't as interesting. But like this is their house and it's like so filled with like artifacts of like things that they've done.
Yeah, I will agree that I think it was fun looking and seeing what happened with each of the characters and all that, and finding out about the characters that you know and care about, where they wound up. Speaking of those situations, I think in the fourth game that the mansion level, it just killed me with that walking around and like looking for a certain notebook and just like opening
Yeah.
every drawer, looking at every artifact. And I liked it was fun that you broke in there and then the ladies are she's like, oh wait, you're these children, and because she worked with their mother, and then she conveniently dies immediately after, and the cops are there. And I'm kind of making fun of the sheer plot convenience of it, but that's kind of once again it's a fabric of the series. They're constructed on plot convenience and insane situations getting worse and worse, inconceivably until something gives. I like that about it. I like that about the scene. But everything leading up to the point where you're trying to break out of the house is just like molasses.
No, I agree with that to a certain extent. Some people like really think it destroys the entire video game, where it's like these moments where you just walk around and explore little items. It's maybe like 5% of the overall game, I want to say. So, I mean, like, I feel like people kind of act like it's way bigger than it is. But when 5% feels like molasses and 95% doing other shit, like, I get why it stands out, though. Well,
Yeah, I mean, overall for me, I would give it more than five, but like to get more broad with it though, because I guess I like
yeah.
factoring in like those levels where it's just level exploration, we'll call them, where you're just scavenging. That might be about five, but then the scenes where it's like in-game cutscenes essentially, where you're just walking around slowly waiting for dialogue to finish, or we have to talk to someone, or you have to move a box, or you have to do that kind of thing. I would say a good
Hmm.
25% of the game probably felt kind of that way to me, where it was just
Yeah.
like slowed down to the point of like, and I'm cool level exploring. I'm one of those people. I'll look everywhere and go through every nook and cranny. I don't mind that. I don't even mind slow games. But there's definitely a good portion, like a very significant portion of this one that wasn't just slow paced, but just not interesting or not enjoyable for me.
Yeah, I hear you. And it really comes down to preference of like how invested you are as a gamer with storytelling, like what you want out of each game franchise. Like, because like I said earlier, I play Uncharted more for story than for gameplay. Honestly, Uncharted 1 is so much repetition of gameplay, and I actually want more story feedback. It's like there are some points in Uncharted 1 where it's just like shooting over and over and over again, and I actually get quite bored. Whereas you or maybe somebody else would get bored at exploring the mansion or their house in the epilogue or whatever. It
Yeah,
really
well, I
just comes
mean,
down to personal preference. It's really hard to please everybody, especially with this series. And like you said, I think Uncharted 2 it probably has the best balance.
yeah, I definitely feel like there's a middle ground, and like like the epilogue. Even though I don't like the epilogue, it was a pretty big damper on it for me. Um, because I was happy with the ending up until that point as a conclusion. But like that, at least you have an emotional connection and an interest, to what you're seeing. A lot of the exploration, not just in the fourth game either, but even like I said in the third game and some other games, you're just looking at random artifacts and random things where it's like a diorama of ships, and it really doesn't contribute really much of anything. You could look at
Yeah,
the title
no,
of
I
some
hear
art
that.
piece, and that's it.
I feel like some artifacts are better than others, right? Because, like, in my
Yeah,
opinion, the Last of Us series does artifacts better than Uncharted, where it's like, Uncharted, you might pick up some random bullcrap treasure, and it's like, yeah, you can look at it. It doesn't really add as much to the experience. Whereas, it's really cliche, especially for these games, but like picking up a note like this dead person or whatever, and like reading it and actually understanding what their life was about or things like that. Those are the artifacts that I actually kind of enjoy more, which essentially is just reading in your video game. But it
Yeah.
accepts the monotony sometimes.
It's like Watchmen in the scenes. I forget the character's name, but there's a novel with excerpts littered throughout the book or different magazine
Yeah.
articles that you can read, and you really don't need it for anything other than broader context of the world and the politics of the novel. But
Hmm.
then, yeah, in Last of Us and other games, like Silent Hill does this, Resident Evil does it, Doom series, I think Doom 3 particularly does it. Um,
Mm.
and you learn about the characters and you get little short stories, essentially, we'll say, or little short vignettes written out. I don't know that Uncharted like does it as well as other things like Last of Us. I think it's a slower game. There's a lot more talking and dialogue, but that's the
Yeah.
structure of the game. I think Uncharted. The issue with it for me is even with like the pirates, for instance, in the fourth game, and you don't have to read them, so it's really not that big of a deal. But it doesn't ultimately add much. Like I read every one that I found, and essentially you get the same story where it's like the captain's evil. He's too obsessed with the treasure, and I'm gonna get out while I can still have my life. Next to a
Mm.
skeleton like 8 times.
Yeah, it's definitely just for context. It's just it doesn't like to score the game or like make it a way better experience. But that's the thing too is like a lot of times we forget to talk about this because I feel like you and I have played the Uncharted games the same way, where we do try to find everything we can, but we don't obsess over finding all of it per se. That these things are optional. So some people who might
Exactly.
just want to gun for these games can just skip all that crap. If they pick it up, they don't have to read it either.
No, I definitely do agree with that. I like doing because I feel like I want to get the most experience I can from the game. I want
Yeah,
to
and that's
really
how I feel.
indulge in it, especially a game like this where like I probably won't play an Uncharted game the full way through again for quite a while. Not because I don't enjoy them, but because they're experiences. It's not just a level.
So I think we talked about everything on Uncharted 4. So what would you score this game?
I'd probably give it a 7.5, like the third game. I think their strengths are almost opposites of each other in many ways, but I feel like
Yeah.
both of them are pretty uneven games with very strong strengths and not horrible weaknesses. It's not like you're ever like, oh, screw this, this is awful, this is a bad game. Because they're not bad games, they're both very good games. But I think they're both very uneven, kind of stilted games.
Hmm. I can see that. And since I am more about the story in Uncharted versus the gameplay, I would give this game like a 9 out of 10, maybe a 9.5 out of 10. Really, the stuff that bogs everybody else down, it just doesn't. Like, I guess I'm more open to a larger scheme of video games. So, like, to me, when a game makes me like walk around in a mansion for 30 minutes, like, it doesn't really bother me at all. Now, I know it does a lot of other people, but like I never really consider that blemish, in my opinion. So, and then on top of that, Uncharted 4, me at least, refines everything else the series has done, just to its absolute best. So Uncharted 4 is definitely my favorite in the franchise. I feel like Uncharted 1 is definitely my least favorite by a long shot. Repetition and the jankiness definitely stick out in memory. So Uncharted 1 is like absolutely at the bottom of my ranking. 2 and 3 are very close for me. I feel like very similar in story structure, like ratio of cutscenes to gameplay. Obviously have their little differences. They're pretty much on par with each other for me at least. And Uncharted 4 is my favorite. And then The Lost Legacy kind of I would kind of rate it around 2 and 3. Lost Legacy is a good game. It is a budget title. It's fairly short. It's short compared to Uncharted 4, which means The Lost Legacy is actually quite as long as Uncharted 1. Just came out years later, so like the standards are higher, right?
Is it true that you fight Kratos at the end of Lost Legacy?
Well, I'm sorry, what was that?
Is it true that at the end of Lost Legacy the final boss fight is Kratos? from God of War.
Yes, actually.
Oh, dang it.
He- he's Indian Kratos, actually. There's like a he's a fun villain. He's like this Indian dude that's obsessed with some bullshit
Is
that I
that
can't
actually a
remember.
thing?
But the final boss is like on a train, so it actually tries to give you some Uncharted 2 vibes before you finish the story.
That's funny. Yeah, it's like I said, I almost got it today, but I figured I'm burnt out on games right now.
Oh yeah, I don't blame you. The only thing that Lost Legacy does differently that's not in Uncharted 4 is there's a moment in the Lost Legacy where you basically get an open world. It's like a mini open world, and you can do like a series of like treasure hunting obstacles. There's like four things that you have to do on the map, and then other smaller things. You can do them in any order. So you actually get a little bit of an open world experience in Uncharted, which they toyed with that idea in The Lost Legacy, and then they incorporated that into a portion of The Last of Us 2 as well. So that was kind of interesting. And if you love Chloe and she's your favorite character, then like you should definitely play The Lost Legacy. But otherwise, it's definitely a spinoff. It's definitely a side quel if you couldn't get enough.
Yeah, so I take it that you would be excited for an Uncharted 5 if it was announced.
To be honest, I actually think Uncharted should be done. I think Naughty Dog is so talented and have four flagship franchises to their name, and Uncharted effectively has five console games if you count Uncharted 1 through 4 Legacy. And I think they had like one or PSP, PS Vita games or
Yeah,
some shit,
yeah,
which are
they have
really
a PS Vita
we don't
game.
talk- yeah. They obviously aren't developed by Naughty Dog anyway. I don't know. I feel like Uncharted 4 wraps up the Nathan Drake story so well, and the Uncharted series is a Nathan Drake story. I feel like Uncharted should be finished. Honestly, it's really good. I don't feel like they need to keep milking it. Movies are kind of different. So like, I want an Indiana Jones 5, but like, you have four 2-hour movies. Whereas Uncharted, you have like four 10-hour plus games, right? So it's like, I feel like I've experienced these characters and stories enough, and I would rather Naughty Dog like come up with a new IP, instead of just rehashing the same one. Because Uncharted had a good decade, 2007 and 2017, if you count Lost Legacy. So I feel like that's enough. I don't think they need to harp on it more. And the only reason I can see them maybe doing a fifth game is if it would follow their daughter. Because, like, I feel like, hey, his story played out. He's an old man. Like, isn't that what we fought for? Kind of in his story, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I definitely think that there's room for kind of spin-off sequels or something like that. But Nathan
Yeah.
Drake's so integral to the appeal of the game. Like, I think you could have the same game and make it just about as enjoyable without him. I don't think he's necessary for the formula.
Yeah.
He's a big hookup, and I do enjoy the character. It would be weird not playing as him. But
Mhm.
I definitely think that the formula and the style could work with another character. For instance, his daughter, if they want to do one, 5, 10 years down the road. Because I would like to see the formula develop with technology and change. And I agree, the story is pretty
Yeah.
much over. But I'm open to it continuing. But I'd rather wait a good deal of time before that may happen. And honestly,
Yeah,
I
I
hate to put it this way, but Lara Croft's been around a lot longer than Nathan Drake, and that's a series that reboots and has endless sequels. So really, we're going to get that continuation in one way or another, just due to the inherent similarities between these franchises.
Yeah, but like Laura Croft is always like more cartoony to me, whereas it's kind of a sense of realism to Uncharted that the Tomb Raider games didn't have until the reboot, and I don't feel like Uncharted is not a series that you would want to see rebooted because the story and the characters were like so integral. Like you don't want to like restart on their like journeys, right? So I'm not super against a sequel if it had like an interesting premise, looked really cool. Like of course I'd be down for it. It's definitely not something I'm clamoring for at the same time.
Yeah, and to clarify my statement, I guess what I was saying was that essentially this formula and this kind of franchise or gameplay environment will be continued probably in a Tomb Raider sense, because whereas
Mhm.
this series does have kind of finite capabilities in storytelling, Tomb Raider, and I've only played a few of the games. I played it on PlayStation 1, the original game or two, and then the most recent release are the only ones I've played thoroughly. And
Yeah.
it's a franchise's franchise. I mean, it's a cash cow. Uncharted is a franchise as well, of course, and successful, but it definitely feels more intent and have inherent goals other than making money. With no disrespect to the other one, like it's a product, I get that. So I guess
Yeah.
what I mean is like I'm interested in the environment and climbing and that kind of platforming to see that develop. But we don't need Nathan Drake for that to happen, and we don't really need Uncharted either to see that happen.
To be honest, Naughty Dog has been relying on Uncharted and The Last of Us as their critical and commercial cash cows a decade and a half. PS5, I would love to see them just make something brand new, honestly.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a lot of people agree because where it seems where Last of Us 2 leaves a lot of things is that I don't think people are gonna be clamoring for a sequel anytime soon. Whether you love it or hate it, it's a pretty divisive thing, I guess. It doesn't seem
I'm
like anybody's like, what happens next? You know?
so interested for you to play The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2 because, like, you don't have that 7-year attachment to The Last of Us fans who have with playing a sequel, and you're playing both of these games back to back as well. So
Well, I'm
obviously, when you
not
finish,
actually. I'm
well,
actually just
definitely,
playing the first.
definitely this topic too.
Well, my thing is like I would play the second. I'm open to it. I'm open minded to it. I've heard a
Oh,
lot of
you
shit,
better.
but here's the deal: is that it's like $60 and it's like 30 hours, like you said, and I just don't have. I actually do have the money, but I don't have the time, and there's just like a backlog of other games I still need to beat. I'm playing the first one because I was lent it by a friend, so it was kind of that thing where it's like, okay, I just beat these other Naughty Dog games. This one is kind of not my copy. I would play the
Oh yeah.
second at some point, but I'm not doing it. It's actually just kind of coincidental timing. Not that I'm avoiding the second game, but it's actually just more circumstantial, actually, because I didn't plan on playing the first right now either.
Oh, that's funny. But like, it's a storytelling marvel. Both of the Last of Us games. So I know they're not as like cliche or cookie cutter as Uncharted. Well, eventually, we'll have to make it a podcast topic if you play through them both. Which I know you're playing through one now.
Yeah, that's definitely a potential topic. Might take a
I'll
while.
hold them to it, folks.
Well,
As if anybody's listening now, because we got a 3-hour podcast on our hands.
I was gonna say, do you have any closing comments?
Not really. The Uncharted franchise is something that I had a lot of fun with when I played through them all back in 2016. Colton hasn't played through them all, so if I experience them again, I'll probably be watching him play them. Because like they're not quite as replayable to me, at least, as like the kind of like arcade addicting experiences that you might get in a Nintendo game or a Sonic game or something like that. You really got to be committed. They're like story driven games. You really got to pay attention, and sometimes you don't always have the time or energy for that. So that being said, I really enjoy them. But it's kind of like for me, it's like, you know what? It's a one and done. You experience them yourself, and I'm super glad that I have. And they're really good games. They show many modern games at this point that video games is like an art form, also a storytelling medium, can accomplish certain things that like perhaps the other mediums can't quite do.
Yeah, to add to that, I would say that, as someone who's recently discovered this franchise, I'm glad I did. I had fun with them. Like you said, I'm not going to be replaying them weekly or anything like I do some of the games I grew up with. But they're very charming and very clever games is the best way I could describe them. I don't know that I would say, like genius or visionary, because they're very formulaic. They rely heavily on tropes, and that's fine.
Yeah.
They use them well. They're very economic games as well for the most part. But
Mm.
they're just very fun games, and now that they're a little bit reduced price, I definitely recommend playing them. And
You
yeah,
can find the Nathan collection first three games for so cheap, and even I did like a couple of years ago. Like it's amazing how cheap you can actually find these games.
yeah, I got them for $3.
Right? Like that's crazy to me because like Nintendo Switch games, man, like those aren't gonna get down to $3 like ever. I don't know what it is with some of the PlayStation games, but you get bargain.
Yeah, I'm not
Really low.
complaining, and that's the thing. It's zero risk at that point. I mean, even if you play the first game for an hour and it sucks, like that's the cost of like a Mountain Dew.
Yeah, right. Pretty much. So you got a lot of bang for your buck.
Yep. So I think I'm good to end it. So I'm gonna
All
say
right. So I'm Eric Savinsky.
I'm Todd Crawford.
You've been too cool for the comic shop. We'll see you guys in the next episode.